Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, and in today's video I'm going to be giving you 6 tips for using shrink plastic. I do have some other shrink plastic videos on my channel, but I thought it would be good to do a video just talking about my tips rather than just showing what I do. So I'm going to be making these charms in this video and giving you 6 tips on how you can use shrink plastic yourself. So let's get on with it. So my first tip for you is to think about the surface you are using on your shrink plastic, and there is shrink plastic on screen but you can't really see it as it's clear and I'm on a white background, but I am drawing on shrink plastic at the moment. And this specific shrink plastic is frosted, so that means it has a rough surface, so it is great for using colour pencils. You can also get smooth shrink plastic, which is good for using Sharpies and markers, but if you do get the smooth shrink plastic you can sand it down, which I've done before. You can use sandpaper or a nail file to sand it down and that works just as well, and you can use pencil on it that way if you don't have the frosted one. You can also get coloured shrink plastic. You can get white shrink plastic. I don't really like using the white shrink plastic though, as it does get muddy quite quickly, especially if you're using pencils. It does get quite muddy with the pencil mark, so I like to use the clear stuff, but it's totally up to you on what you would like to use yourself. So my second tip for you is to work from light to dark, especially if you're using colour pencils. So for Dragonite here I started with the lighter colours of the yellow and then built up the shadows on top, and then I used the greens, and then I did the line art last, especially if you're using colour pencil, because if you do it first it's going to smudge everywhere on the plastic because of the surface of it. So you need to just work from light to dark. If you're using Sharpies this doesn't matter too much, but you also need to bear in mind that the colours will darken when you put it in the oven. So if you're using yellows it's not too bad because it doesn't get too dark, but if you're using like greens and blues and reds then it will get darker. So always work lighter, and this applies to whatever you are using, whether it is pencils or Sharpies or markers or even pens. If you want to use some gel pens on it you can use gel pen on it as well. And obviously your design will shrink, that is obvious, so you do need to do it bigger and the colours will get darker. But it doesn't matter too much about coverage. You don't have to be as neat and as precise with your colouring on shrink plastic as you do when you are colouring on paper, because it will get smaller. So if you don't get 100% coverage, that's not too bad. That's not the end of the world because it will disappear when it shrinks. So I have just done a Dragonite here because Dragonite is cool. I've done a Keytar, which is my, I say cape or backpack for my Fortnite skin that I really love. I just love it, so I thought I would do a shrink plastic design. And I've done a couple of Among Us characters because they work really well for the shrink plastic. They just work nicely because you're doing block shading for it, and then I just outlined it last. And you don't need to use expensive colour pencils for this, you can just use Crayola. I think most of these are Crayola or cheap pencils that I got from WH Smith. And yeah, you can draw whatever you like, but just remember to draw it bigger and work from light to dark, especially if you are using colour pencils. So my next tip for you is to do with cutting out, and I would recommend using some smaller scissors like I've got here, because shrink plastic is quite tricky to cut out. It will snap very easily, so the smaller your scissors the better really. And it's also good to turn the shrink plastic, which is kind of the same thing they teach you in primary school when you're cutting paper really, but I just forget to do that. So just turn the shrink plastic and just cut out very carefully. And of course once you've cut it out, before you put it in the oven you can add a hole with a hole punch, which is what I like to do, which means you can attach a jump ring to it easily. So that is what I'm doing here just before I put it in the oven. And of course you need to follow the directions on your specific shrink plastic because all of it is slightly different. So I'm going to put it in the oven now, and I have taken it out the oven, and these are how they shrink and how they look, as you can see. Then my next tip for you is when you get it out of the oven, when it is still hot, it might be not quite even and flat. So to flatten it out, you can just add a heavy object on top, like a heavy book or a food can or something, and just flatten it out before it cools down, and that will flatten it out and make it look that little bit better. And tip number 5 is to touch up your shrink plastic once it's out of the oven. So I'm just touching up Dragonite's belly here. You can do that with pencils. You can even add some paint pens on top if you have some Posca pens or any other type of paint pen. This works really, really well. So finally, we need to finish our shrink plastic off, and my favourite thing to use is nail varnish. I like to add a little bit of sparkly nail varnish, especially to this key tart. I thought it would be quite appropriate. And then some clear nail varnish over the top just to seal in the design. You don't need to do this if you're using Sharpies so much, but if you're using colour pencil you will, because otherwise it will scratch off. You can also use maybe Mod Podge if you don't want to use nail varnish, or some resin. I do have a separate video on using resin to finish off your charms, and I will link that in the description down below and in a card. But these are my tips for shrink plastic. It's a bit of a shorter video because there's not too many tips to say, and I just wanted to show how I made these and maybe give you some helpful tips. But that is all for today's video. If you like this video, emotionally, do leave it a like down below, as that really helps me out. But that's all for today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.